Namaste, dear friends, and a very warm welcome back to this course on Introduction to Indian Psychology. In our previous two lectures, we've been looking at the different schools of mainstream of Western psychology, and we see that they have different approaches to understanding the human nature with structuralism and functionalism, the research methods that they use, and the understanding they have, therefore, in terms of their practical applications. In the previous lecture, we looked at behaviorism in great detail and also understood why it is so relevant in today's world, where we do see our environment influencing our behavior in several ways. And I was just thinking about it that, for example, the entire social media world today is literally sizzling our brains with dopamine and exciting us to get addicted to all these gadgets because of this constant like. So all these rewards that we're getting is constantly making us go back to these social media websites and everything that follows from there. And so today we are going to be looking at psychoanalysis and see how they are talking about human nature, what are the methods that they apply, and finally what are its connections with the approaches of Indian psychology. So to give you an overview of the lecture, we will look at the context and introduction to psychoanalysis, followed by Freud, who is the father of psychoanalysis, and his main theories, then Carl Gustav Jung and collective unconscious, Alfred Adler and individual psychology, Karen Horney and cultural neurosis. She was one of the first feminist psychologists. Then we have Erik Erikson and lifespan development, then research methods that were used to understand or to study psychoanalytic approaches, then criticisms and limitations, exploring the convergence between psychoanalysis and ancient Indian wisdom, comparative frameworks with other schools, and finally exercises and food for thought. So what was the historical context that allowed psychoanalysis to emerge? During that time, we see that consciousness was rejected as being insufficient and unconscious forces were discovered. And meanwhile, human behavior was being studied. Hysteria patients showed no organic brain disease. Hypnosis revealed memories influence present behavior patterns powerfully, and childhood trauma seemed connected to adult neurosis systematically. So what was psychoanalysis' revolution in psychology? Psychology then shifted focus from consciousness to unconscious mind systematically. Who were the key pioneers of this movement? We had Sigmund Freud, who was the founder of psychoanalysis, followed by Carl Gustav Jung. He talked about the collective unconscious. And then we had Alfred Adler, who was a pioneer for individual psychology. Then Karen Horney, who was a theorist for cultural neurosis. And Erik Erikson was a theorist for lifespan development. So let's look at psychoanalysis, which took up momentum in the late 1880s onwards. So the father or the founder of psychoanalysis is Sigmund Freud. So talking about the foundation of psychoanalysis, Freud was an Austrian neurologist who revolutionized psychology fundamentally and permanently. His major work was the interpretation of dreams that he wrote in 1899. He developed talking cure for hysterical patients therapeutically, and he discovered the unconscious mind shapes behavior systematically and always. He said that childhood experiences create lasting adult neuroses and conflicts. He founded psychoanalysis in the 1890s that revolutionized modern psychology and psychiatry. This is a quote of his where he says that the unconscious is the true psychical reality. So what are some core principles of psychoanalysis? The central idea is that the unconscious drives the early childhood experiences and shapes behavior. The key characteristics are that it is a theory of personality, there is the unconscious mind, defense mechanisms, stages of psychosexual development, and dream analysis. What were the methods that he was using? Free association, dream analysis, transference and therapy, etc. And he introduced psychological dimensions beyond the conscious awareness, and clinical psychology emerged. Here is Freud's structural model, where he talks of three parts. He says there is the id, the ego, and the superego. So what are these three? So he basically describes the human being like an iceberg, where he says 3/4 of it is submerged in the unconscious. The unconscious mind consists of 3/4 of the human being, and we are only conscious of the superficial 1/4 or the surface level 1/4. So he says that id is the primitive desires, impulses, pleasure-seeking, unconscious principles within us. The ego is the reality mediator, the rational decision-making that happens consciously. And the superego is the moral conscience. It follows the societal rules and is internalized deeply. And he says that there is a constant conflict between them that creates anxiety and this internal struggle. There is a dynamic tension between with competing forces that then help to shape personality. Let's look at Freud's defense mechanisms theory, where he says that that's what tends to protect the psyche. So he has these few and a few more, but these are the main ones that we are talking about. So he talks of repression. This is the pushing painful memories into unconscious deliberately. For example, forgetting a traumatic childhood event to protect yourself from the pain that it gives. Second, projection. So attributing one's own unacceptable thoughts to others externally. And an example again, a cheating spouse, for example, accusing their partner of being unfaithful. Displacement, here we see that there is a redirecting of emotions from original target to a substitute. For example, a boss yells at you, so you can't shout back at him, you come home and you yell at your children. The next one is rationalization. Here we are creating logical explanations for irrational behaviors unconsciously. For example, failing a test and saying that I didn't study because the teacher is unfair anyway. Then there is sublimation. In this case, the channeling happens of unacceptable impulses into socially acceptable activities. For example, a person with aggressive urges goes on to become a successful aggressive boxer or a surgeon, so which requires that energy and outpouring of their suppressed emotions or energies. Denial, this is the outright refusal to admit or recognize that something has occurred or is constantly occurring. For example, a person with a serious addiction who refuses to admit that they have a problem. Then we have regression, retreating to an earlier developmental stage in response to stress or to anxiety. And an example of that we see quite often is that an adult throwing a tantrum or whining when they don't get their way for whatever they want. These are just another few pictures to capturize it visually for you. But there is this cute cartoon here where he says that I am not hungover. So that's denial. Okay, you can very clearly see where he is. Then he says, you are hungover. That is projection. Then you suck. So that's displacement. And finally, I feel awesome. This is reaction formation. Okay, so building up its own image. What are the practical applications of defense mechanisms in life? So in terms of relationships, projecting insecurities onto partners, okay, in order to protect ourselves. And this causes unnecessary conflicts. So one has to be aware of these processes, these unconscious processes, so that we can also go on to maintain better relationships. Then in work environment, there is the displacement of bosses' anger onto family members wrongly. This happens ever so often. In the health sector, we have the rationalization of unhealthy behaviors as perfectly acceptable. So that entire justification that happens, the rationalization. Then in the sphere of creativity, there is a sublimation that transforms emotional pain into artistic expression. So we see art therapy as being a very, very contemporary way of therapeutic release. Then in recovery, different kinds of recoveries, awareness of self, of these defenses, enables conscious choice for health. Moving on to an exercise where you can try and identify your defense mechanisms. So I hope you have your pen and notebook ready. Try and see if you can recall any stressful situation. What emotions did you feel? Fear, anger, shame? So as I'm taking you through this, I really hope that you are closing your eyes and that you're following along. Then examine the response. How did you handle the uncomfortable feeling? In terms of defense mechanism used, did you try to deny it, project it, displace it, or rationalize it? Your awareness. When do you activate specific defense mechanisms? Is there a predictable pattern? And I would also add to that, why do you apply those? And finally, in the growth concept, how might understanding these defenses enable healthier coping mechanisms? Moving on to the next big theory that he talked about is Freud's psychosexual stages, where he basically says that in the oral stage, which is from birth to the first year, the erogenous zone is the mouth. Then from the first to the third years, which is the anal stage, the erogenous zone is the bowel and the bladder control. And you can see how this actually happens in the course of our development. Then in the phallic stage, between 3 and 6 years, the erogenous zone is the genitals. Then in the later stage, between 6 and puberty, the libido is inactive. And then in the genital stage or the puberty to death, there is maturing of the sexual interests. So Freud also talks of the psychosexual stages of development and the fixations that happened if those stages were not fully matured and one evolved beyond them. So he says, for example, in the oral stage, which the erogenous zone is the mouth, he says if there is a fixation, then the consequence is that the person is orally aggressive, which they will express through the chewing gums, ends of a pencil, etc. If it is orally passive, then there will be smoking, eating, kissing, or oral sexual practices. In terms of the anal stage, when the bowel and bladder elimination take place, the psychological fixation would result in anal retentive, where there is obsessively organized, excessively neat. Then anal expulsive is reckless, careless, defiant, disorganized. In the phallic stage of the genitalia, we see there is the Oedipus complex that develops in boys and the girls, where they get attracted to the opposite sex, especially the boy gets attracted to the mother, the girl is supposed to get attracted to the father. Then there is the latency or the dormant sexual feelings. So there will be sexual unfulfillment if fixation occurs in this stage. And then the genital time is from puberty to death, where the sexual interests mature, and if there is a fixation, then there is frigidity, impotence, unsatisfactory relationships, etc. Another important contribution of Freud was his dream analysis. He said this is the royal road. So the manifest content is what you remember, the surface dream story. But he says there is also a latent content, the hidden meaning, unconscious wishes, desires, conflicts. And there is dream work that happens, condensation, displacement, symbolism that distort true meaning. And then there are symbols. So there are universal symbols like water, house, animal. These represent deeper meanings. Then analysis. So if we can know how to analyze dreams, they reveal the unconscious desires, fears, unresolved conflicts, etc. What are some practical applications of dream interpretations in different scenarios? So we see that in anxiety dreams, for example, when there are exam dreams, this reveals stress, unprepared feelings are manifested. Then when you have falling dreams, then there is experience of loss of control, anxiety about failing professionally visible. And then the flying dreams, often they reflect that there is a wish for freedom, escape from current constraints are desired. And then there are the death dreams. These are not literal. They imply transformation, change, new beginnings are indicated. And then there is this chase dream. So there is an avoidance of feeling, running from responsibility. These patterns come forth. Giving you an exercise on analyzing your dreams so you sleep more consciously tonight and see what you recollect the next day. So try and also recall a recent dream very vividly. What happened? Who appeared? And then what was the manifest content? What is the surface story? What are the literal events that are being described? And then the latent content. What is the deeper meaning? What are the hidden wishes, fears, unresolved issues? What are the symbols? Are there any recurring symbols? Do you see houses, water, animals, people, or objects? And how can you interpret them? What might these dreams be revealing about your unconscious concerns? And in fact, the whole dream world is a very, very important area of our exploration, because it is one third of our life is spent sleeping. If you're sleeping 8 hours a day, let's say, and it is, and therefore this period is normally a very unconscious period. So yogis and people who are working on their spiritual goals, they pay a lot of attention on what is happening in the dreams, because if one wants to evolve spiritually, if one wants to work towards self-transformation, getting a better insight into the unconscious and the subconscious can throw a lot of light in how, in terms of how we behave in our active world. Moving on to Carl Gustav Jung, he was a pioneer of analytical psychology. So, in terms of the foundations of analytical psychology, we see that Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist who founded the analytical psychology. He extended Freud's work. However, he rejected Freud's sexual emphasis and instead he proposed the collective unconscious concept and the concept of archetypes. His major works include The Psychology of the Unconscious in 1912, which was a groundbreaking book that offered a revolutionary perspective. He introduced introversion, extraversion, personality dimensions, and influentially that they were very important concepts. Individuation, here he talked of the integration of opposites to achieve whole and balanced self, and this was very important. His quote is that the collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of man's evolution. Okay. Again, there are very interesting parallels with the Indic idea where they say we have gone through 72,000 lives. So because we are part of nature, we have evolved from nature in many ways. So all those experiences are embedded in our genetic structure. So a lot of fascinating parallels can be found. In terms of the collective unconscious and archetypal dimensions, what are some core principles? So we talk of the personal unconscious. Here the individual has repressed memories and personal experiences. What about the collective unconscious? So he says there are shared human patterns, universal symbols, archetypes. What are these archetypes? They are universal characters. They can be shadow, persona, anima, animus, self. Then he also talks of the shadow, which is repressed, the unacceptable aspects of personality that are projected externally. And finally, what is this persona? In fact, the word personality comes from there. So it is the social mask we present, the false self versus the authentic self. And we start, an exercise that I can give from here is just becoming aware of the different masks that we are wearing. So what are some practical applications of archetypes in life? So in terms of shadow work, we see that integrating disowned traits helps personal wholeness gradually, which means that there are often parts that we don't want to acknowledge within us. There are shadow self. So the more we are able to accept it and acknowledge it, the more we are become whole in ourselves. Then there is persona awareness, which means the authentic expression when the public mask relaxes completely. And to share here, when they tried to measure the vibratory field of an individual, they found that an individual who lives authentically, their vibratory field is far more powerful than those who are living with different kinds of masks. In terms of relationships, they say the anima, the animus, projection causes attraction, conflict, growth, opportunities. In terms of creativity, there is artistic expression that accesses the collective unconscious, from where there are symbols that are drawn, universal themes emerge. Moving on to spirituality, he says that individuation parallels spiritual awakening towards authentic self. So the more an individual starts becoming a conscious human being, the more they start separating themselves from the unconscious, the collective unconscious, and moving towards their more authentic, unique self. So Jung, to just add here, he was in touch with Indian philosophy and greatly inspired by those ideas. As an exercise to explore your Jungian archetypes, for shadow exploration, try and see what are the traits that you dislike in others. Because it might be that you are trying to project something within yourself onto somebody else. Then persona awareness, public self versus authentic self. Can you note the difference? So basically it would mean an observation and introspection to see that how often are you able to be your authentic self and how often are you carrying masks when you interact with the world. For anima and animus, we see that opposite gender qualities within you. Is integration possible? Okay, so just become more conscious of what are the archetypes in terms of the gender traits that are existing. In terms of self-realization, wholeness is the goal. So integration of opposites, is that gradually progressing in your own life? And when it comes to individuation, what is personal meaning, authenticity and wholeness in the journey for you? At what stage are you currently? So take these points down and you can work on them. I know there's a lot of exercises coming your way this week, but I think if you take them up one by one or if you just choose to make your entire day more conscious, then I think we would already be taking a few strides into what Indian psychology is inviting us to do. So it is very good in a sense that there are so many invitations for self-exploration through these different theories of Western mainstream psychology. And we have some Jung's food for thought for you. He says that your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. Moving on to Alfred Adler. He was a pioneer of social interest and inferiority. We talk of the foundations of social interest and inferiority. So he was an Austrian psychologist who emphasized on social connection and striving purposefully. He rejected Freud's sexual drives. He proposed that instead there are feelings of inferiority which are universal to human beings. And some of his major works include the practice and theory of individual psychology, understanding human nature, what life could mean to you, etc. Then, in terms of lifestyle concept, he talked of the patterns of responses to life situations that have formed. And then the birth order influences personality development throughout our entire lifespan significantly. Next, he talks about the goal-directed behavior. All actions are aimed at overcoming inferiority. So it's a very interesting focus that he has on this inferiority idea. And he says finally that it is easier to fight for one's own principle than to live up to them. So this is a very profound thought, I would say. Adler's social interest and inferiority, what are some core principles? So human behavior is purposeful and oriented towards future goals. The feeling of inferiority drives us for striving for superiority and self-improvement. Social interest is the central indicator of mental health, and personality develops from early childhood experiences and lifestyle thereof. What are some practical applications of social interest and striving? So overcompensation. So because his focus is on inferiority complexes within individuals, he says this feeling of inferiority drives for perpetual achievement, of excellence, of superiority, to strive to become better than the others. What are some birth order effects? So he says that the firstborns are perfectionists. The youngest one is always seeking attention, and the middle one are negotiators. And these, I think, are also socially influenced significantly. Then we have the lifestyle counseling. In this case, we see that understanding patterns enables conscious choice for change. Then there is encouragement therapy. In this case, building self-worth happens through recognition, belonging, contribution. And then there is community connection, social interest, development, enriches meaning and well-being. So you see this whole movement that is going in structuralism from trying to understand the impact of society on my mind. So the consciousness structures to the functions, to how our environment is influencing us, and then we're moving towards the collective unconscious, and then how social interest. So it's a very interesting movement that the psychological schools are going through in the discovery of human nature and what it is capable of. So just an exercise for you for assessing your inferiority and goals. So childhood inferiority feelings. What areas do you feel inadequate and why? Then what are your current goals? What are you striving towards? Are they compensation patterns for this inferiority that you might be feeling at some level? In terms of birth order, were you the firstborn? Are you the middle or the youngest? Has your personality been impacted because of this in very evident manners? In terms of lifestyle patterns, how do you typically respond to life situations? Then social interests, what is your connection with community? Do you find contributing towards others as a meaningful exercise? So many questions again for you to think about, but I would suggest after the class to pause this, or even now when you're listening to me, you can put the pause button. Just sit with these. It'll take you maybe 5 minutes to answer all of them. But then your diary of self-observation will gradually be increasing as you go through this, and by the time we arrive at Indian psychology. So Karen Horney, she was the first psychoanalysis pioneer. So what are the foundations of this feminist psychoanalysis? Horney herself was a German-American psychoanalyst, and she founded the first feminist psychology and social theory. She rejected Freud's penis envy because he talked about the fact that, women have this penis envy, and she instead proposed the womb envy to counteract his position. Then she also talks of the basic anxiety concept, where the child feels helpless in a hostile world. And this could have come from, again, childhood experiences of having a very negative experiences growing up. Then there is the neurotic trends where there is compliance, aggression, detachment, and all this can come as coping mechanisms. Then there is the real versus the ideal self, the incongruence that creates psychological distress notably. And I would say that this is very often a feature with a lot of people who take on the spiritual path, because there is this ideal that is presented in front of them, and we are all aware of our present reality, which is not always aligned with those ideas. And this incongruence, according to her, results in a lot of distress within the individual. She says that neurosis is always replaced by a substitute satisfaction. What are some of the core principles of feminist psychoanalysis? She says that neurosis develops from basic anxiety that is caused by disturbed early relationships. Cultural and social factors shape personality more than biological instincts, and that individuals develop neurotic needs as coping strategies for anxiety. Finally, personality reflects movement towards, against, or away from others. So again, the social dynamics becomes important in these contexts. What is the practical application of this real self and neurotic solutions? She talks of compliance, where there is excessive people-pleasing, self-abandonment, resentment, building silently over. Okay, so when we're constantly trying to, bend backwards in order to please others. Then there is aggression, there's a domination attempts, there is aggressive competition, relationships, exploitative, combative tendencies. Then detachment. So there is an emotional withdrawal, isolation. This is a superiority defense against vulnerability. So if you're not connected to anybody, there's no question of feeling hurt, and therefore it's another way of arriving at protecting oneself. Then there is integration, which is moving towards the real self, a more authentic connection with healthy boundaries. And finally, growth, where self-compassion reduces tyranny of impossible perfectionist shoulds. Okay, so this people who have a lot of ideals and very idealistic, they have these very stringent standards for themselves. And so here she's saying the self-compassion, which later on is also talked about developing more self-love, would then allow us to be more considerate about one's own limitations. An exercise for you to explore your neurotic trends. So what is your dominant coping style? Are you a compliant person? Are you an aggressive person, people-pleasing in the first, aggressive, where you try to dominate over the others? Or are you more the detached sort who works on withdrawal? And then there is a basic anxiety, so childhood feelings of helplessness. Do you suffer from that? What is your parental relationship impact? And this is a very, very important idea. The harmony within the family has a huge impact on the experience of the child in terms of the security. Then the tyranny of shoulds. So the perfectionist standards, your shoulds, statements dominating, is that something that you tend to do in your life? Then the real versus ideal self. What's the gap between the authentic and the perfect self? Then the integration, moving from neurotic trends towards authentic self-expressions. So again, take your time to see where you stand on this chart of self-discovery through the neurotic lens. We then move on to Erik Erikson, who was the pioneer of the 8-stage theory. So he was a German-American developmental psychologist. He expanded Freud's stage theory profoundly, and he shifted focus from sexual drives to socialization and identity development. His major works include Childhood and Society, and he introduced the 8-stage theory of psychosocial development. There was a psychosocial crisis. In each stage presents a turning point, conflict requiring a resolution. And then in this 8 life stages, he talks about trust through integrity spanning entire lifespan systematically. So the importance of trust in the healthy development of the individual. Then what are some basic virtues that he talks? He says that strengths are gained from successfully resolving each stage crisis. Naturally, at a different stage of life, we experience different challenges. So how do we deal with those? And his statement is that in the social jungle of human existence, there is no feeling of being alive without a sense of identity. What are these 8 stages, 8 psychosocial stages? He talks of the first as being infancy, trust versus mistrust. Hope emerges from safety and security. In stage 2, in early childhood, it's autonomy versus shame. The will emerges from independence. So the child starts saying no to whatever the parents might be proposing or anyone else. Then there is stage 3, the preschool, that is initiative versus guilt. Purpose emerges from exploration. So should one do, or I should not do more than I should do? So how does one negotiate that? In stage 4, there is the school age, industry versus inferiority. Competence emerges from mastery. So one has to keep pushing oneself to gain that mastery, and the more one has a mastery, the less one will feel the sense of inferiority. So industry means putting that effort to overcome one's inferiority complexes. Then in stage 5, there is adolescence, identity versus role confusion. So fidelity emerges from identity. The more we are authentic to ourselves, the more we have clarity on how to deal and what is our role in the world that we live in. Moving on to stage 6, there is young adult stage. So intimacy versus isolation. Puberty is setting in. Then love emerges from connection. Stage 7 is middle age. There is generativity and stagnation. So either care emerges from contribution. So either we are into a generative phase or a stagnant phase. Then in stage 8, there is old age, integrity versus despair. So wisdom emerges from life reflection. So depends on how meaningful we've been able to make our lives, the more peaceful we will be in terms of how we look back upon life's journey. In terms of integration, there are the early stages impact the later stages, and unresolved conflicts complicate the development. So these childhood experiences are really important, and therefore when we talk of either the school experience or we talk of the house environment, just understanding that the kind of parent one is, the kind of teacher that one is having a huge lifelong impact on the child. So to do it far more responsibly. Then in terms of resilience, there is positive resolution that builds basic virtue, negative creates dysfunction. In the psychoanalytic methods, the research and therapeutic approaches, so there is free association, patient freely speaks to whatever comes to mind. Dream analysis, interpreting of dreams reveals unconscious wishes and conflicts. Case study, this entails detailed individual analysis where depth is prioritized over breadth. And projective tests, so there is the Rorschach, the TAT, that reveal unconscious material through interpretations. And then there is a transference analysis where the patient's feelings towards therapists reveals also past relationships. So the exercise for you would be that in life stage assessment and integration, current stage, where are you developmentally and what crises are you addressing? Or what crisis have you addressed already? In terms of past stages, were your conflicts resolved? Is there unfinished business remaining? Virtues developed, which basic virtues already have you cultivated? And what's the evidence in the present? Then regressions, when stressed, which earlier stage do you regress to? Okay, so when you're under different stressful situations, which stage do you like to fall back to? And growth edges, what virtue would support your current developmental stage? So enjoy answering all of these as well. Now let's look at some psychoanalysis research methods. So as you can see, because a lot of emphasis was on the subjective, dream world, trance state, so this was the room that Freud used for conducting his sessions. What are some strengths and contributions? In terms of depth exploration, this accesses unconscious material and we start understanding complex behavior. In terms of therapeutic effectiveness, the long-term psychoanalytic therapy produces significant change. Then in terms of comprehensive theory, it explains development, motivation, personality, pathology, all of this systematically. Where does cultural influence matter? So we are transformed psychological. There is transformed psychology, psychiatry, literature, art, popular culture. All of this is shaping our unconscious. And how do we play them out in our life experiences? Then in terms of self-knowledge, he encourages profound introspection, personal insight and awareness. So psychoanalysis, what are some of its limitations and criticisms that are acknowledged? So there is a lack of scientific evidence many concepts are untestable, unfalsifiable scientifically, and therefore science has a problem with it. There can also be a gender bias because Freud talked of penis envy, so feminine psychology criticizes it, and this criticism is also historically a valid one. Then there is an overemphasis on childhood. So adult experiences, current context underestimated significantly. So I would say that one has to be very careful with the modern studies that are also coming up in epigenetics and all, where they're saying that the first few stages of our life, the first few ages of our first few years of our life are extremely crucial in forming even the physiology. The genetic component is shaped by the experience we have then. In terms of subjectivity and bias, therapist interpretation, there is researcher bias that influences finding. There is cultural limitations, Western individualistic assumptions, applicability across cultures is a questionable phenomenon. What is the psychoanalysis model of the human being or the pan? So here the core assumption about human nature is that it presents a fundamentally complex, conflict-oriented model of human being based on unconscious drives, childhood experiences, and intra-psychic conflict. The psychoanalytic view sees humans as essentially conflict-driven, conscious mind versus unconscious drives, and this is an ongoing internal struggle. Developmentally determined, which means that the childhood experiences create an enduring personality patterns throughout life. There is unconscious motivations within the individual, where there are hidden wishes, fear, desires that drive behavior outside of our awareness. There is dynamical complexity and there is multiple competing forces that shape our thoughts, feelings, behaviors constantly. Then it is historically shaped. There is past experiences, profoundly influence present functioning, relationships, choice, defended against the psychological defenses that protect the ego from anxiety and unacceptable thoughts. Comparison with some other models. So we see that human nature and behaviorism is passive responder shaped by environment. In humanism, it is inherently good, autonomous and active, whereas in psychoanalysis, it is conflict-driven, unconsciously motivated. What is the key motivation? In behaviorism, it is reinforcement, escape from punishment. In humanism, it is meaning, authenticity, self-actualization. In psychoanalysis, it is unconscious drives, conflict resolution. The problem origin, it's maladaptive, learnt behaviors are conditioned. In humanism, it is incongruence between the real and the ideal selves. Then in psychoanalysis, there is the repressed or the unconscious conflicts that are the source of our problems. In terms of change process, environmental modifications and reconditionings facilitate change. In humanism, it is the authentic self-discovery and acceptance that facilitates it. In psychoanalysis, often it is the catharsis through insight and awareness. Moving on, the role of consciousness in behaviorism is irrelevant. Observable behavior only matters. In humanism, it is central because subjective experience is fundamental. In psychoanalysis, it is limited. Unconscious is dominating always. In terms of view of growth, in behaviorism, it is limited. It is shaped by contingencies. With humanism, it is unlimited potential for continual growth. And with psychoanalysis, again, it is limited because the childhood experiences determine what will happen significantly. In terms of the therapist's role, in behaviorism, we see that the behavior engineer modifying the environment. Then the humanism, there is genuine compassion that supports the growth. And in psychoanalysis, the expert analyst uncovers the unconscious and helps grow. In terms of human agency, in behaviorism, there is no agency. Entirely the environment determines the individual. In humanism, there is full agency, personal responsibility. In psychoanalysis, it is limited by the unconscious drives and conflicts. So what are some similarities with the Indian tradition? So there is a concept of sanskaras, which is past experiences. They create this lasting mental patterns that act like repression. Vasana, here there is unconscious drives, that desires that drive behavior, just like the id impulses. Then there is the ahankara, or the false self construct, that parallels Freud's defensive ego concept. Then there is mukti, or liberation, so the psychoanalytic insight that parallels transcending ego consciousness processes. And finally, dharma, or purpose. This addresses the life purpose which parallels Erickson's generativity and meaning making. Some more convergences. So, chitta vritti is mental modifications. One understands the unconscious patterns like psychoanalysis explores them. Then there is a concept of kleshas or afflictions. Psychological suffering comes from ignorance, which is parallel to Freudian neurosis concept. Then pratipaksha bhavana, or opposite thinking, so defense mechanisms that transform our approach, these are aligned. In terms of brahmacharya, there is celibacy, channeling energy. So energy sublimation parallels Freud's concepts of sublimation in the defense mechanism mode. And then there is tapasya, or austerity and discipline. So psychological work parallels the psychoanalytic process and that requires effort. So what are some contemporary psychoanalysis approaches? These are modern extensions and also involve integration. So we have this object relations theory. Here the focus is on internal representations of relationships formed. Then there is the attachment theory. Here early caregiving relationships shape lifelong patterns fundamentally. Then there is self-psychology. This focuses on self-development, empathy, mirroring and healing. There is interpersonal psychoanalysis. Here personality and mental health are fundamentally shaped by social interactions, not just internal drives. And finally, integrative approaches. Here there is a combining of psychoanalysis with cognitive behavioral therapy, somatic, mindfulness techniques. So let's look at psychoanalysis versus some other schools and a comparative framework. Here we have psychoanalysis versus behaviorism. The unconscious drives versus observable behavior only mechanistically. Then with humanism, there is determinism, pathology focus versus growth potential optimistically. Then there is cognitivism. Here there is the unconscious emotion versus rational thought, logical restructuring. Versus neurobiology, here we see that psychological meaning versus brain mechanism, subjective importance. And then there is integration. Here each school contributes valuable incomplete perspectives towards understanding. So I think when we study all these different schools, we see that it's like this elephant that is there and everybody is, catching one part of the elephant. And they say that this is the truth. So if somebody is holding the leg, they will think, oh, the elephant is a pillar. And then if somebody holds the tail, they will think it is something else. If somebody holds the trunk, they will think it is something else. So the elephant does have all those parts, but it is more than just the parts. It is a complete creature in itself. Similarly, the human being is being understood from various lenses, but there is also an integral story to who the human being is, which consists of all of this and more. So some food for thought. From Freud, he says that the interpretation of dreams is the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind. And some more food for thought from you, this time from Erickson. He says that the more you know yourself, the more patience you have for what you see in others. So here are some references. And finally, a lot of work to do for all of us. And this is a collective journey. So as you work out the dimensions of your being, I think we're all in different processes to learn, to share. So let's enjoy the process and share your insights, because that would add more meaning to everybody's collective journey. Thank you.